A warm welcome to the first paper session of the day, which is about changing gender relations. And the first talk of the day is by Stefanie Ernst from the University of Münster. So,
yeah, hello everybody. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. I would like to talk about, if you compare it with Goudsblom's long-term perspective, middle-term changes. So just to say this before I start, my agenda is the following: just a short information about the theoretical background and the thesis. Recently, I published a paper about that, so I give a quotation to that, and then I state that describe that we have since we had very, very long so-called gender trouble, we can use Butler's term here. I think meanwhile we also have a discrimination or diversity trouble. And there are goal and target conflicts. It's not an harmonious balance between these two very big enterprises to develop a good idea of equal policies. And with a few results of my research project in a European comparative project with Italy, I would like to give you some original statements from councillors, from people working in the administrative area to manage diversity and to manage equality policies, and the EU Charter of Diversity. So starting with some illustrations, I mostly like to use illustrations. On the one hand, the gender trouble thing is an evergreen in history. Here you see that also in ancient times, in the Greek and Roman empires, there have been discussions about gender roles. And it seems that especially when the journals have nothing else to talk about, they invent gender politics again and discuss it very extremely. And the one extreme topic occurred nearly 15 years ago is the identity policy thing and diversity. And it's really a problematical discussion in that way that it goes on about resources and management problems. Coming to my paper, I'll give you the original quotation. It says that if you use Kaswauter's informalization and formalization theory, you can see that during this forward and backward movement, informalization processes helped to bring the topics of inequality to the agenda, but it needed formalization processes as well to empower women, to empower outsider groups to go on the scene. And this symptomatic insecurity and the dynamic of human relationships in this context goes hand in hand with growing individualization, and that's a paradigmatical change in the last years, that we went away from collective ideas of equality towards more individualized ideas. And the span is widened between the sexes and diverse groups. As someday it's called LGBT. Other terms are used. I think nearly every 2 weeks there is a new term for that. That makes it so difficult to define. But it has to do, of course, with the 1960s sexual revolution that is still ambivalent until today and implies more advantages for heterosexual men than for women. So a new social character seems to appear, the old white man. And this old white man is accompanied, meanwhile, I think, by old white women called feminists. And here we have a big debate in the moment that it's not without danger, I would say. It has to do, of course, with what Wouters mentions, just to give you a quick idea, that it has to do with a controlled liberalization or regulated deregulation. So we have to find the balance between this political or social aspects of social development. It has to do, of course, with things that Elias described as a complex polyphony of the movement of rising and declining groups over time, and it is still largely concealed from view. And at that point, our project started to look for these new phenomena concealed from view. Shame, as Goudsblom mentioned, has its own dynamic, and I would like to concentrate, he wrote an article in Human Figurations about that, on the manifestations. I think there are new kinds of manifestations and the occasions. Because here, the discrimination and equality discourse has to do with a new shame regime. That's my hypothesis. And so far, that the tolerance, on the one hand, towards diverse groups increased. They are allowed to show their vulnerability. They can make a discourse. They don't have to hide it anymore. But on the other hand, we have also a fear, especially of this old white man, to be disempowered as a privileged group that increasingly has to feel shame or really feels shame. We have it's a part of this mutual identification of these old white men, more or less, that also they say gender issues matter, equality matters. And if I go to the middle term or short term developments of the last 20, 30 years, especially the equality policies had been invented end of the 80s. It's a long time. And we have to see the socio and psychogenetic aspect in that new players came to play, and they play in this long-term developed ambivalence of the gender and inequality disputes and balances. Connected with this is that the social integration demands, of course, a change of habits. And regarding migration topics, my colleague Elmar Falani, for example, described it, and also Annette Treibel, that social crimers live in a permanent mismatch of habitus and social context. They experience very often gratification crises. They have the formal right to enter the scene, to enter organizations. I'm a management and organizational sociologist, so my examples go to this. And it also can be, on one hand, can cause the disorientation or a retreat, or also creative learning processes. And that is the point where diversity management or other things hit to. Increased but less explored is, of course, a sensitivity and discrimination awareness, which we find out a bit with our small data. The public pressure of social liberation movements has manifested in these institutional practices of equality policy in the European context called gender mainstreaming, or what you should know, I think. So this development of this institutional answer to this diversity and equality problem could be seen on the one hand that there had been a big hype in the 90s, more or less, in the 1990s. Then it went to resistance, open resistance of sexists. People remind you to Me Too campaigns, and they show this resistance. And the paradigm change that is very important to know. I just don't want to go too deep in this epistemological context, but it's important that we, as Andrea Bührmann, using Foucault states, we have a paradox of individualization and culturalization and as well essentialization of difference. What does it mean? It means for practical management aspect, for example, that we have to square the cycle, and that's very difficult because on the one hand we have to switch from equality treatment to distinction, and that way that we should not exclude these new groups who want to be handled as individuals with their individual sexual identity or whatever concerning to the diversity dimensions. And you can imagine that this on the management level causes conflicting goals and overload of people who have to manage equality policies. On the one hand, we have this anti-feminist resistance in organizations. Men feel disadvantaged because we have so much equality policies in favor of women. On the other hand, we have very diffuse campaigns from several diversity groups. For example, this could mean that if you look for equality policy, how to implement it in organizations, should key figures, as a quota in Germany, for example, represent the population's share, or should it represent the employees' share in that company or organization? Moreover, are regulations and sanctions enough, or is it useless? Or does it help, like in Sweden, to bring up such an image pressure that firms and companies on their own do something for equality policies? Or is punishment the right way? Really severe sanctioning, like firing sexists from their job. Whatever, this happens, and is a real severe, intensified discussion, I would say. So these blaming and shaming, normally a privilege of established groups, has a bit changed towards underprivileged groups who are, for themselves, doing anti-gossip or praise and brain gossip, we know it from Elias, to empower themselves and to blame these old-fashioned persons who are against equality. And if you see it in the paradigm change, how to operate in different arenas, here on the left one, that is the law dimension of European Union and other things. It's the Charter of Diversity. In Germany, we have the Allgemeine Gleichbehandlungsgesetz. In the middle, it's the management answer, diversity management and all this stuff. They celebrate diversity and are a bit naive, I would say, or economizing the individual. It's a critique. And then for an educational arena, it's a teaching diversity discourse. I can't go in it, but just to have it in mind. So discrimination, we have the success concerning the awareness that discrimination takes place and that it's a problem, and that people are right when they describe that they experience it. That has something to be done against discrimination. That's accepted, more or less, in the population. On the other hand, especially younger persons see again that we have a success in gender equality, but original related discrimination occurred again, or is still on the scene. Our original inquiry shows therefore different results. The majority seems to see there's a success in emancipation and equality, but on the other hand, we have also still discrimination that has been reported from our federal office in Germany, compiling the whole population. So if we, if we look for several dimensions, I can't give you all material here, but we ask our interviewers, what has happened in the last 25 years in your perspective? And they said, yes, on the one hand, concerning sex, sexuality, sexual identity, we have a wider perspective. But, for example, in Münster, after the first gay demonstration in the 1970s, we have self-help rehabilitation and other good institutional answers of the problem, but we have still more subtle and hidden discrimination. So he says that there was a big hype in the 90s for 8 years, and then it changed. It was politicized, and then it changed to individualized perspectives connected with this identity politics. So he said, it's a bit a problem that it could be depoliticalization. So it's a very interesting discussion, I would like to say. And concerning migration, also experts say that on the one hand we have subtle and institutional discrimination that continues, but compared with a middle-term perspective, Elmar Falani says, we have successful integration in Germany instead of segregation in the education and labor market. Concerning gender, and that's a topic where I'm most familiar with since years, it's also this ambivalence that comes to be expressed here. Men hardly suffer discrimination, it's said in the inquiry, and also the data from management shows that top positions are still predominated by men for 90%. That has to be explained. It has nothing else to do with qualification. There are qualified women, for example. But women had a little success in that way that they reached the middle management position up to 40%. That's a real good change. And on the other hand, we have re-intensified myth and sexism. So this Me Too campaign and debate, I think, triggers the sociogenic anxiety of men negotiating gender relationships, if you go to this special aspect. Our data, coming to the conclusion, should have shown that the social ambivalences of ascending and descending group are on the move. It's a very dynamic development and not a one linear development. It goes back, forward, it is differentiated towards more the phenomenon, it's on the move. The result of successfully intended, formalized, but undirected, that means informalized social changes and behavioral ideals has to do with it, I think. It's very good to work with Cas Wouter's book about formalization here and to apply it to social movements and the dynamics. Because the span between formerly known as this established outsider discussion has on the one hand shown an increased tolerance, feelings of inferiority are allowed, but shame and professional ideals of equivalence and diversity also exist and came to the surface, to the screen. So what does it mean? That was what we did in our project for the organizational culture of companies, because it's the informalized or the informal area, and it's so important especially for social climbers to learn how this informal area works, how to enter an organization. And here we can see that we have the beginning of discrimination-sensitive quality development processes. It has started, yeah, that's very good. But the most social movements say we have to be anti-racist, discrimination-free. And I think this is a naive ideal, and this leads to this overload in the organizational practice to implement equality policies. Because people divide. We divide, and it must not mean that in the moment we divide, that it's still it's every time in hierarchy. It's not every time in hierarchy. People divide, and so I think we have to go also to this epistemological problem behind this. And meanwhile, we can say the freedom from discrimination is a bit too naive. We can say about discrimination sensitivity, that's a very interesting thing, like diversity, sensitivity, gender sensitivity trainings are taking place in this under this label. So what will be for the future very interesting is the question, shall we go, or could we expect a kind of hyper-formalization and a hyper inclusion? What is with sexual orientation contrary to the heteronormativity culture? So what happens? Because on the one hand, what I experience is, for example, homosexual persons who are in the company are mostly coerced to go in this outing, coming out. But it's a very personal thing. It's a psychological, social psychological thing, very private. Is it okay that an organization has interest for that and make policies with this? I think it's a very ambivalent problem. But on the other hand, inequality aspects like being part of half of the population concerning gender, or visible disabilities or whatever, it's another thing. So we have different qualities in different diversity dimensions that has to be very carefully handled. Otherwise, I think we have again this problematical, more or less dramatical exclusions of really tough and good feminists. As you remember the problems at The Guardian in England, I think a very good feminist person, he said, gender is real. She was accused for being whatever. She was thrown out her job. It's a very dramatic and severe problem, and I would ask, cui bono? So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefanie. Any questions, comments? Don't be shy. Marta, yes, of course.
Yes, thank you, Stefanie. And just a small remark on the established outsiders, because I think it's a very interesting point that this blaming and shaming strategies and spreading gossip, like this blame gossip, has become available to the outsiders. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very, it's as Linda calls it, the Goudsblomian moment in it. Mm-hmm. That's the moment where technology really matters. It changes, it turns the tables, so to say, mm-hmm. on the heretofore established old white males, as you said. So I would be interested in your opinion on the impact, real impact of this blaming gossip on the group cohesion between women? Because that's that would be the hypothesis. Okay, you get the possibility to communicate and to share information, so you should be able to go for a form of group cohesion that was before the technological change actually only available to the established. Does that happen? Would you say it happens, or is there really a plethora of bubbles with information spreading to a very limited extent?
Oh, very good question. Thank you very much. It's very difficult to answer because I think meanwhile we can't talk about that feminist movement. We have a lot of feminisms, and so all divided and structured by age. The elder feminists have a completely different point of view, but they had been successful in that sense. I think we have to do research on it. I think that they had been very successful to enter the scene, to enter the organizations. I think the quota and equality policy is a result of this strong feminist group cohesion. Women entered the scenes, they had been lawyers, or wherever they have a position to influence this process. But on the other hand, if we go to this expert, he said we have in the beginning it was a politicized process, and then we had this individualization. I think to find new collective formational structures is a great challenge nowadays, because we have very much individualized policy scenes. You look for the identity policy thing, and it goes strictly against these elder feminist debates. And as normally you should expect, well, there could be a solidarity or an openness. What happened in the beginning of the first or second, after the Second World War, the second feminist movement, where the women's liberation movement cooperated with the homosexuals movement. It was a more or less good cooperation, I would say. They were very strong and did a lot to enter, for example, the European Union's charter and all these equality things. But I think we have to the paradigmatical change as a problem. How can we create a good group cohesion that helps to change things and not to destroy several persons, to say it very dramatically? Thank you.
Any more comments, questions? Over here.
Thank you. A very short question. You write about data. What kind of data do you have about these very important and interesting processes? Have you done any focused research on these issues? And if so, what are your results? So, data. That is my question.
Yes, thank you, Miklos. Of course, that's important, but I don't want it to bore you all with this 70% that and that and that. We made an inquiry. The Italians had 5 councils to ask for what is the situation of discrimination, who mostly suffers from discrimination. And in Germany, it was only our district in Münster. We had a population survey with more or less 300 persons, and then we made experts interviews with 20 persons being engaged in self-help movements, students of gay, lesbian organizations called Together or Track or whatever, and we have experts to implement in the business administration arena equality policies. And so we compared this, made a comparative thing between these different kinds of methodical aspects, qualitative, quantitative data, and the big enterprise will be for the future to make a bigger comparison with the Italian data. It has to be done still for the future. Okay? Thank you.
Okay, so in respect to the other 2 talks, I think we can move on. Thank you, Stefanie. Next up, we have Marta Bucholc from University of Warsaw.
Right. Thank you, Valerie. Thanks for having me to this panel, and I'm so thrilled to be a part of this discussion on gender and women and women's rights. And my talk is actually about women's rights and their relationship, a difficult relationship, I think, and a complicated one, with the legal governance of abortion. So what I'm going to talk about will be, first I will tell you how the legal governance of abortion emerged globally, as a global regime, because this is the assumption I'm making, and I think it's a defensible one, that there is an emergent global regime for governing abortion legally. Then I will tell you how this relates to women's rights and why I say that this relationship is a difficult one. And then I will make a few attempts to make sense of this process in terms of Eliasian sociology of social processes. And it will also be, as Stefanie's talk, a midterm talk, so it will only spread backwards as far as the Second World War. And I should probably explain one thing in advance, what I mean with this semantic indeterminacy. It's just a fancy way of saying, well, it can be many things. So the meaning is not established. The meaning can be and is negotiable and indeterminate in the sense of being open-ended to changes. And of course, if something is semantically open-ended, this also paves way for misunderstandings, communicational misunderstandings. And I will only offer you one small thesis coming from the research that I'm only starting to do now. So I will not offer you any hard data. I will offer you a way to make sense exactly of the changes that I will be talking about. So first of all, the emergence of this global governance of abortion. It did take a while in coming, first of all, because for a surprisingly long time, abortion was, of course, it was thematized by global organizations like the Catholic Church especially, as a part of the reproductive morality and reproductive religious ethics. But in terms of legal governance by states, it lasted until basically 20th century for any large-scale patterns to emerge. And these emerged within the imperial governance structures, on the one hand, colonial structures, that's the point I'm not going to cover in this talk, and of course then the neo-imperial, if you like, structures like the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc after 1920s, including the impact of the Soviet reproductive law on the whole Eastern Bloc area. So there was a certain amount of standardization within abortion law, but it was related to state structures. And the real booster for the global abortion law regime came with the emergence of the United Nations and the global human rights regime. But even that, it wasn't done at once. It did take a few decades for abortion to become really a subject within the human rights regime. I will just offer you now my very brief overview of what I think are the most important features of the global human rights regime as far as abortion governance is concerned. So first of all, it's a multi-level system, as you know, comprising the United Nations, the regional systems, and the nation-states' legal orders. It's a system that's not really very strongly interconnected internally. The regional systems are much more interconnected regionally than the whole global structure, if you like. And of course, the regional systems also differ between themselves. 3 of them are particularly, let's say, well developed or fully developed, and they have their own human rights jurisdictions. And these are crucial from the point of view of governing the laws within the nation states and standardizing the laws of the nation states. Still, within the regional systems, starting with the European one, the best developed, the most influential globally, and ending with the African one that is sometimes described as highly aspirational and not completely developed thus far. This is, of course, a contentious point. All these systems display very strong centripetal tendencies and centrifugal tendencies. There is a certain gravitational force, especially to the human rights jurisdictions, but there is also a tendency to avoid their influence. So it's a hell of a figuration, you know. And within this hellish figuration, the place of abortion law has been negotiated since the late 80s, basically, when the subject first arises in the context of human rights. Before that, abortion was basically conceived of within the imperial and national legal orders as a problem for criminal law, basically, national criminal law. And suddenly, since the 80s, people are starting to think about abortion as a problem for human rights. This is a major shift, because it opens up a possibility of universalizing the problem. And then, of course, that domestic criminal law, like Durkheimian mechanic solidarity kind of thing, becomes a more detached and more relational view of what abortion or a termination of pregnancy is as a legal and as a social phenomenon. Then the notion of reproductive rights arises, and of course abortion then becomes even more detached, medicalized, and related to sexual health and to sexual reproduction. And all of this, and that's a very important point, is very strongly related to women's rights. So there is a lot of criticism on the notion of reproductive rights as basically being about women, even though men reproduce too, and they do it sexually. But reproductive rights are somehow always thought of as the rights of women. Therefore, abortion is mostly framed, and increasingly since the 80s, framed not as a criminal law problem, but as a women's rights problem. And here comes my thesis. So abortion is a hell of a difficult thing to frame within the human rights logic. And I will just give you one argument for that. I would be happy to elaborate on it. This is the difference between the way in which various human rights jurisdictions form their opinions of what is consistent and inconsistent with human rights in terms of abortion. People do not really speak the same language about it. They do not see it the same way. It's a very complex issue. And by getting associated with abortion, women's rights get a kind of what I would call a secondary or a derivative semantic indeterminacy, because abortion is so very semantically difficult, and women's rights get, in Latin there is this thing they call assimilatio temporum. So you get the same form, the same tense from a sentence that has really no interest in giving you its tense, but it's just nearby. So it's just the same thing with women's rights and abortion, the legal governance of abortion within the human rights system. And this would be my explanation of the empirical impulse for getting into this field of research for me, which is the fact that what I would call a civilizing offensive taking place since the 90s to have abortion acknowledged and recognized as a human rights, access to abortion, I mean, of course, free access to legal abortion, came to a halt in the early 2000s. This is quite a surprising process, and this was, I would say, a civilizing offensive in the very strictest sense of the word. So a way to get those nations and those societies who are more perceived as more backwards, more religious, not less well integrated in the international community, to slowly move towards recognition of legal access to abortion as a human right. This ended, and the expected further progress of this tendency was halted. This is shown, for example, by the reluctance of international human rights jurisdictions to dig deeper into national legal orders in order to defend the right of women and girls to get legal abortions. And this is one fact, and this fact, I would say, a very, what is the good neutral word to use? A very significant point turning point in this process was the Maputo Protocol to the African Charter of Human and People's Rights of 2003. And in the Maputo Protocol, in Article 14, abortion, the legal access to abortion was recognized as a human right. And member states of the African Union were encouraged to provide for this right to be secured in their legal orders. And nothing much happened. And I would say Maputo Protocol is the single act of international law that's very undercited regarding the breakthrough that it was really for the first time to say in an international treaty level legal act that there is actually something like human rights relevance in abortion directly. Nothing happened. Moreover, and this is my final point, what we see now is a decivilizing offensive. So a return of the much more involved and, so to say, disintegrative approach to international human rights governance of abortion. And this we see not only in countries like my home country, Poland, where there is a strong opposition against the applicability of international human law in Poland currently. And as you know, this is also the case in many other countries. The countries that were strong on promoting protection of human rights in the context of abortion access are also backsliding on their higher standards, including many African countries. In countries who have had big reforms to abortion law, access to legal abortion is also made more and more difficult, and Germany is also being named as one of the examples for that. So there is a strong decivilizing offensive, and what I think will happen, and this is my final point, in the nearest future, will be a very strong clash of these two civilizing and decivilizing offensives. There are some signs that we might indeed see again a rise in these centripetal tendencies in the human rights figuration, and much is expected currently from the European Court of Human Rights. 1,000 claims, 1,000 cases have currently been accepted by the court from Poland alone after the 2020 change of the abortion law in Poland. And it is possible, therefore, that this very paradoxical situation of integration and disintegration, interplaying in a very long perspective, will bring about more global integration, well, in our days possibly, and maybe will also partly solve, the semantic indeterminacy of abortion within the human rights system, thus contributing to more semantic determinacy in women's rights. This would be my expectation. It's a very optimistic one, and I do not really think it will come about, but this is the note that I wanted to end on, and I will be very happy to hear your ideas and suggestions on that side. Thank you.
Any questions and comments for Marta? Okay, you first, and then I'm gonna go.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Marta. My apologies. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about this semantic indeterminacy because you hinted that you have more to say about this, and I'm curious what you will. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I would basically, in thinking about it, I would focus on the way that the meanings of various human rights are construed, especially in the jurisprudence, because, of course, the effect of the jurisprudence is absolutely crucial. Even though you get the covenant law, the treaties, and this highest, if you want highest level of international law, it can only get an effective on the local level where humans really live via implementation either in the domestic legal order, and then there is no problem, or by enforcing international jurisprudence. So international jurisprudence is an excellent source of knowledge about how these rights are construed. And then, if you compare how the European Court of Human Rights interprets the right to life, for example, the right to live, or the right to health protection, or to freedom from torture, in the context of abortion, it is highly inconsistent even within this one single jurisdiction. And then if you compare it, for example, to the Inter-American Court, there was, at the end of the last year, there was this case pending before the Inter-American Court, Manuela y Otros versus El Salvador. This was a horrible, well, the factual situation was quite horrible, of course. But this was a case where everybody said, okay, now's the time for the Inter-American Court to cut on the semantic indeterminacy of the right to be free from torture, because this was exactly the point. And it didn't. It just say, okay, the penal sanction was inadequate in the Salvadoran legal order for attempting or conducting abortion. That's all. So there is a lot of indeterminacy in the sense of using these rights variously and perceiving them as interrelated in various ways. There is a whole nexus of meanings, and this nexus is unstable. So that is basically what I was going to say. In the African system, there is very little jurisprudence by now on abortion, but it's also developing very quickly. But countries are resigning the jurisdiction. They are no longer recognizing the jurisdiction of the African courts. So there is a lot of dynamic also institutionally there. But that's basically what I would mean with that. Thank you. Sorry.
Hi, this might be too big a question, but I was just really interested that you're talking about the semantic change in kind of the upper levels or the legal system. But when it comes to like campaigners and the kind of people at the front of moving this movement forwards, I don't know, but what I've witnessed is the rhetoric's the same as it was in the women's rights or human rights. It's still on posters and banners, and I'm quite interested why this has changed so much at the top, and if you think that's going to feed down into a change in terms of like muddying the waters about the issue for the campaigners themselves.
This is a very good question, of course, because on the one hand, it's like you say, the basic framework in the campaigning, so in the advocacy movements is there. If you think about this, what's frequently, but I don't think it's quite the correct way to refer to it, like pro-choice movement. But on the, what is again, I think not quite correctly referred to as pro-life movement, there is a lot of change. There is a lot happening there in terms of mobilizing human rights as an argument. And of course, the American debates would be most interesting in this case also because of the problematic standing of the US vis-à-vis human rights and human rights jurisdictions for that matter. But it is, if we look at both sides, there are more than two, but if we look at all the sides, there is a lot of semantic dynamic going on. Firstly, and secondly, I think it will certainly muddle the waters, as you say, because, of course, this is a two-directional movement, and this advocacy is also taking place at the highest levels. So the feedback from down there will get up there finally, and this is also what is happening already. There is quite a body of literature on that, on this pro-life side. So this side is underestimated, I think, as far as the impact on the semantics of human rights is concerned.
Okay, so I think we have another talk left. Thank you, Marta. Thank you very much. And next up, also from the University of Warsaw, is Pawel Baginski.
Hi, my name is Pawel Baginski, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Doctoral School of Humanities at the University of Warsaw, and I work at the intersection of sociology. All right. It's better? All right. I work at the intersection of sociology and cultural studies. I'm a part of a research group led by Professor Bucholc, where I cover the topic of the treatment of women and LGBT+ minorities with regards to Polish national habitus. In my MA, I did a research on on Me Too action on Polish Facebook through the lens of Elias and Foucault. In my doctoral research, I've made a step back and investigate selected Polish women's magazine with the aim of describing changes in the norms of treatment of women during the post-socialist transition. By using the Eliasian perspective merged with gender studies and affect theory, I focus on the problems of domestic violence, sexual harassment at work, and habitual behaviors towards women in order to examine how specific behaviors are redefined as violence against women in the context of Polish culture, the reproduction of which depends on a family to a great extent. There was a paradox in the initial title of my paper, and unfortunately, I won't be able to unravel in it today's talk using the empirical material. And instead of theoretical exploration on the social acceleration of time, my objective for today is to share with you the initial empirical findings about the time frame for investigating the post-socialist transition, understood as a temporality characterized by decivilizing tendencies in the treatment of women. My talk will be in 4 parts. Firstly, I will give a historical introduction. Secondly, I will briefly describe my adaptation of the Eliasian concept of time. Thirdly, the source of empirical data, the magazine Zwierciadło, or The Mirror, will be introduced. And finally, I will support my argument with a few examples from The Mirror. Okay, so moving on now to presenting the historical background. Along with the growing influence of the Catholic Church, the neoliberal regime and the work efficiency seemed to play the main part in transforming relations between men and women in post-socialist Poland. While there are many publications on abortion as well as the marketization of Polish economy, the analysis did not cover the gendered aspects of skills and the attitude viewed necessary to cope in times of crisis. In the following presentation, I will argue that the burden of the post-socialist transformation was, as usual, put on the shoulders of women. According to the research by Kaja Kaźmierska and colleagues, in the face of the structural unemployment in the 1990s Poland, people turned for help to the traditional institutions, and many survived thanks to family ties. And now, I would argue this strategy of survival reinforced patriarchal gender roles in which women experienced in managing their households in times of crisis were treated as a resource used for coping with the hardships of post-socialist transition. My next point is the post-socialist transition understood as a times of crisis. I refer to Eliasian notion of time as a symbol that enables cognition and regulates the social habitus, thus individual behaviors and social integration. Johan Goudsblom, in the paper The Worm and the Clock on the Genesis of a Global Time Regime, claimed that time is a function of the social activity of timing. According to Goudsblom, timing is a mental activity based on the ability to compare the individual experience of the temporality of social processes with the socially established standards of duration and speed. In the case I'm presenting, the experience of dealing with the socio-economical crisis affected women's timing. They were first to deal with the effects of market changes and retraditionalization in gender order. Thank you. All right. Thanks. Now I would like to briefly describe The Mirror. It is a lifestyle advisory magazine addressed to women with a high social status or aspiring to it. The Mirror has been published continuously since 1957 and is the oldest Polish magazine of that sort still on the market. Therefore, the analysis of the discourse created in The Mirror may provide a coherent picture of historical changes in the norms of gender relations. In communist Poland, the magazine was published by the League of Polish Women, the state-run women's rights organization. For the purpose of this talk, I have read editions from 1986 to 1993. Times of crisis was one of the main editorial topics until the privatization of the title in 1991 throughout the 1980s. At the end of the 80s, the advisory columns gave many tips on how to manage a self-sufficient household. For example, recipes on how to make a potato flour, ideas on how to prepare a remarkable New Year's Eve party at home, or how to take care of your hair when you can't afford to go to the club or to hairdresser. This leads me to the main point I want to raise. I assume that the women's timing of the post-socialist transition emerged in 1980s. According to Stańczak, Wiślicz and Perkowski, historians interested in the reproductive labor in People's Republic of Poland, the retraditionalization of gender order during 1980s was present not only in the conservative postulates of the solidarity movement influenced by the Catholic tradition, but also in the communist government discourse and lawmaking. For example, in coupling plans to extend maternity and childcare leaves with job cuts related to the subsequent stages of the economic reform. What is more, historians claim that, quote, the multifaceted crisis of the 1980s meant that, in the opinion of women, running a household was a constant struggle with a shortage of food and hygiene products, a lack of spare parts for household appliances, with closed service points and queues that consume time and energy, end of quote. I want to underline this ability to heroic coping needed in the face of shortages of almost everything on the market. And now I will turn to analyzing the chosen articles from the Mirror. I start by reading out loud a response to a question posed in the editorial survey, how is it to be a woman in Poland in 1990? The answer by Hanna Jankowska, an activist in one of the newly founded feminist organization Profemina, is 1 minute long, but I believe it grasps the essence of my argument. Being a woman in Poland in 1990 is not much fun. So what I'm about to say will be terribly serious. Admittedly, thanks to women, a home, family and everything still work, but women also bear most of the cost of living an increasingly difficult life. The role of a handmaiden of the family determines her position in society, a person who is not sovereign. The position of a woman in professional life is most accurately described by a thought I heard recently. She is the first in the queue for dismissal and the last for re-employment. All you can do now is to watch how the ideology will be added to the current situation in order to wrap the brutal truth in the bush. They will revive stories about the natural duties assigned to a woman to focus on a family life, about the fullness of life at home with an empty wallet. Jankowska points to the two factors, an ongoing debate on the almost total ban on abortion, which will come into effect 3 years later, and the social cost of transformation, overwork, poverty, and structural unemployment, which affected women in the first place because patriarchal gender order gives men the role of the breadwinner and relegates women to reproductive labor in a household. And from the beginning of the 1980s, the communist government started to gradually introduce unsuccessful market reforms. Stories about the quality of work were frequently featured in the Mirror, condemning the ineffectiveness and praising the market-wise success stories. In this discourse, the low productivity and poor organization of work were portrayed as some of the reasons responsible for the scarcity of goods in the planned economy. These concerns were voiced in 1987 referendum on implementing the market reform, which was the late attempt by the Soviet-backed government to get out of the prolonged crisis and win a democratic support for the plan. In the article encouraging readers to vote in favor, Krystyna Olechnowicz points to the women's role in the process. She refers to their experience in managing households in times of crisis and views it necessary for the transformation of the socialist enterprises and the economy at large. She mentions data indicating that in 80% of the households, women decide on the allocation and spending of funds, establish a hierarchy of family needs and the way of satisfying them, underlining that they have developed coping skills which are of use in times of crisis. And although the discourse in question may be viewed as one of the last chords of the propaganda, it binds together experiences of women in late communism and early capitalism in terms of a daily hardship they had to endure in order to provide care and reproductive work for their families. In September 1989, in the face of hyperinflation as a result of the deregulation of food prices, the main board of the League of Polish Women, the publisher of this Mirror, issued an open letter to the Prime Minister. For almost 10 years, all crises, breakdowns, and economic experiments affect us women in the first place. Governments change, politicians change, and we must constantly remain in the position of suppliers and accountants of our families. Nobody changes us. We are constantly responsible for the well-being of our relatives and the functioning of our households. How much time, health, nerves, and strength it costs in the Polish economy, we know best. The letter proceeds with highlighting the role of the reproductive labor of women. Authors demanded an increased financing of catering in canteens, in the enterprises and schools, as well as creating a service market that would relieve women from many household chores. What the letter has in common with the previous examples is that the prolonged times of crisis appears to be an external constraint which affected women's gendered feeling of responsibility for the family, and hence formed the timing of post-socialist transition as a decivilizing force. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. To sum up, I gave a historical introduction and described my adaptation of the Eliasian framework on time to analyze the women's timing of the post-socialist transition in Poland. Then I've discussed the examples of the press articles from the Advisory Magazine for Women, which showed the increase of reproductive labor associated with the scarcity of goods, services, and money. To conclude, I would like to leave you with the following thought. The decivilizing tendencies in the treatment of women affected women's timing of the post-socialist transition in Poland, which emerged in the 1980s. It originated from the gendered feeling of responsibility for meeting the needs of the family and running a household. On that basis, it is justified to claim the transition in Poland started even before the huge wave of layoffs in the shutdown of privatized state companies, which affected women in the first place, and before a 1993 ban on the liberal abortion law. Thank you for listening.
So, any questions? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. So I have a number of questions, but I think the main question I have is on the concept of reproductive labor that you use, which, so you know, can be very sort of narrowly defined and very widely. And I think what's interesting that your analysis seems to sort of enable various understandings of reproductive labor, both in this sort of very, very narrow way of, having babies, but also in the much more wider way of providing for everything. And can you say something about how you see this, but also maybe how your work could expand this notion of reproductive labor, maybe? And if that's your aim?
Yeah. Actually, I see it as a part of my PhD, and basically I want to go further from that to domestic violence. And the way I see the reproductive labor as a way of providing this gendered feeling, I repeat, for the feeling of responsibility, and the fact that women were forced to stay at home longer and be there longer, I suppose that there will be some connection with the domestic violence and the ways it presented. And I understand the reproductive labor here really widely. And I don't know if I answered your question, but that's the notion I will definitely have to explore more, and it's really fresh. Sorry, I've read it out. These thoughts are so fresh. I wouldn't dare to go freestyle with the talk. So yeah, that's. Thank you for the question. Definitely, I will have to read more about reproductive labor.
You don't have to answer this, but I think there are really a lot of theoretical possibilities in the paper that in the work that you just presented for rethinking and expanding this notion. So well done, and I'm interested to hear how much. I think there will be more theoretical possibilities there.
Yeah, I'm interested in them. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for these two interesting examples from Poland. It's so interesting to make a comparison, and I have a question how it could be handled maybe in the future, because it has to do with the change of figurational ideals between the genders. And in the Netherlands, I think it wasn't Christine Brinkgreve in the 90s, or was it Cas Wouters, I'm not sure, who analyzed feminist journals. So I have a question, your journals, had it been the feminist journals or so-called normal women's journals with a very traditional image of women's roles?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Zwierciadło is rather this the second meaning you've mentioned. It's a women's magazine, lifestyle magazine basically, and it's the work of Wouters on this. Also, he also analyzed the feminist magazines, and what I found interesting, and I really struggle with the question of where to find the normative, like the text which will show me the normativity in current times, actually, when the manners book are no longer read, actually. And right now I'm doing the research on the mirror, and I assume that at one point it will be beneficial for my research to go further with the magazines, which are also lifestyle, but are as well more, let's say, declare themselves to be feminist magazines. Still lifestyle and with rather big circulation, but self-declared as feminist magazines. Yes, we may say like soft feminism or simply like deliberative feminism. I don't know. That's my idea for now.
Okay, it would be the very, very last question, if we can be so generous, but in regards to the next session, please keep it as short as academically possible.
Okay. I'm going to keep it short, even though it's a very broad question. If I get it right, I think you mentioned decivilizing tendencies in terms of women's rights. So less freedom for women is a decivilizing tendency, right? But what are your thoughts about the cause of this in Polish society? So what causes these decivilizing tendencies?
Okay, thank you. I think that it's worth to have the two aspects. I think that the let's say cultural aspect connected with what we dwell on, Polish national habitus and Catholic Church and Catholic tradition in general, and changes in the global economy. And I think these two factors have to be treated as the main points of departure to analyze the treatment of women, because here I focused on work and seeing women as people who know how to work well and they will change the economy and so on. And they are treated definitely here. Okay, they know how to do it. We may use them and their knowledge to pass through this really hard period of the recent history of Poland, which is post-socialist transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Pawel.